growing up, my grandparents redecorated their house at Christmas. I'll have to clarify. I grew up with 42 first cousins. And my grandparents' house was the place that we gathered all together because, well, honestly, it was the only place we could all fit. So at Christmas time, because of my grandmother's love of the season and the magical mysticalness of it, she redecorated her whole house. The basement became a gingerbread house with candy strings running across the top. Fireplaces were transformed into beautiful nativity scenes, and bookshelves became hiding places for candy dishes. It was a wonderful place to celebrate Christmas. But my favorite part wasn't any of those places inside the house. It was outside in the garage, where my grandfather had transformed the garage into Santa's workshop. And he did this by bringing scraps of wood from his lumber yard and putting out nails and screwdrivers and hammers and leaving. It was a kid's dream and a parent's nightmare, especially when there were 42 kids around. And so my favorite thing at Christmas time was to run to that place and to hobble together, to the best of my ability, all kinds of new creations that my grandfather had invited me to be a part of by supplying the raw materials. And after I had created this magnificent creation, I would rush to my dad and I would say, "Guess what it is?" And he would say, "A camel? A donkey? A treehouse?" And he would continue guessing and guessing, which I thought was hilarious, until I finally said, "No, it's a robot." And he would say, "Yeah, I can see that. Well done." It was a creation process, but also it was an invitation into the magical mysticalness of the Christmas season. And in Colossians 1, we get invited into the magical mysticalness of the personhood of Jesus Christ in the creation process. So read with me from Colossians 1, beginning in verse 15. "The Son is the image of the invisible God,
the one who is first over all creation.
Because all things were created by him, both in heaven and on earth.
The things that are visible and the things that are invisible.
Whether there are thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him.
He existed before all things, and all things are held together in him.
He is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the one who is firstborn from among the dead, so that he might occupy the first place in everything.
Because all the fullness of God was pleased to live in him, and he reconciled all things to himself through him.
Whether things on earth or in the heavens, he brought peace through the blood of his cross. This is the word of the Lord for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
What we find here in Colossians is a beautiful scrap. It's actually a Christological hymn that scholars believe was used in a different way. We find it nestled in this epistle, but probably this liturgical hymn was used as worship. So the hearers, the first hearers of the book of Colossians that we read, but they heard, this was a familiar text. Something that they had heard, something that they had worshipped, something that they had used to experience God before. Maybe perhaps like a doxology, or the doxology that we sing in our services. We find another one of these in Philippians 2, 6 through 11 as well, but this one differs from Philippians in that Philippians focuses on the sacrificial nature of Christ, giving up Christ's self, the humbleness of Christ. Here, there is no doubt that the author of Colossians wanted to include this because of the supremacy of Christ. Christ exalted Christ in all things, the beginning and the end. Christ holding all things together. This is supposed to remind us not only of the supremacy of Christ, but also of the creation process. We find a couple of little hints in these 5 verses. First, the image reference. Christ is the image of the invisible God, and this word image is the same word used in the Greek Septuagint to talk about the image of God created in mankind. And so we hear a relation there. We also hear the relation back to Adam, or the first man, or mankind, in the firstborn allusion in these 5 verses. So creation is in view here, but creation is also taking on a new meaning. For Christ is the center of creation, as opposed to God breathing life into all of creation. Now we have creation occurring in and through the fullness and the wholeness of Christ. And this is important for this church, a church who is fearful, a church who is forming, a church who is trying to figure out who this Christ was and what the life of Christ meant. These are followers of Christ, but they aren't quite sure what it means to be Christ followers. So this reminder is a reminder that Christ is in all things and in and through all things. Christ is fullness. Christ is wholeness. Now, for me, this reference back to the image of God and Christ being the image of God is something that's kind of difficult for me. I grew up in a setting where I was taught I was in the image of God. It just was a little bit different because I was a female. I was certainly in the image of God. There was just a higher image in my male counterparts. As you can imagine, when I expressed a call to ministry and a call to preach and a call to pastor, I was what's a good word? Confronted with a lot of explanations of how this was against my image. This indeed was against what God created. But in my soul, in my being, I knew that I had to express this call to ministry. I had to express a call to preach because I could not experience wholeness and fullness through Christ without expressing this. So this passage is personally significant to me as well. For Christ is the image of the invisible God, and we as God's people are also the image of Christ, but also the image of wholeness and fullness. What I didn't tell you about those times that I created these wonderful robots and all sorts of other creations in my grandfather's workshop was that there was many more times that I came to my dad crying because of black and blue thumbs, or bleeding because I had used these hammers and nails that were just out, asking for healing from him and comfort from him. I can promise you this. If you accept the invitation to live in Christ and to live through Christ and to try in some way to exhibit the wholeness and fullness of Christ in this world, you will get bruises, you will bleed, and you will hurt. You will also encounter people who are hurting and who are bleeding. Lauren talked about this, but in my home state, 9 people were killed last night as they were worshiping God. What are we to do in the midst of that? What are we to do? How is creation even made possible? And when I come to a gathering like this, a gathering of ministers and a gathering of Baptist ministers, I wonder about these workshops that we call churches. These places that we're trying to create something new in and through Christ. These places that we're trying to create wholeness and fullness for the world to see. And I just wonder if we brought those creations before God, if it would look anything like something divine, or if it would look like hobbled together earth scraps that have no hint of heaven. I wonder if the things that we are creating in church are more about us than they are about God. I wonder if the things that we are creating in church are more about our image, our name, than they are about Christ's name or God's name. There cannot be fullness in these earthly materials or earthly pursuits. We must, as God's people and God's presence here on earth, combine the earthly materials with the divine likeness of God, who is the person of Christ, so that heaven can come here on earth, so that the divine leaks into this world in some way. There is work for us yet to do, so let's get our hammers and get to work.
Amen.